Hi, everybody. It's just great to be here. Can I get the lights on in the room? Because I want to see everybody. That's great. I'm very honored to be invited here today. It's great. Oh, there you all are. It's so great to see you. I am so thankful that you all have come to talk about and hear about and think about this. It's a really important topic, and it just warms my heart that we are addressing it and that people don't have to deal with this alone, because it's an issue that's been around for a lot of years, but we haven't had conferences about it for a long time. In the 90s we did, and now we're doing it again, which is great. So my talk is about sin, accountability, and forgiveness. Being in a Mennonite crowd, you all wonder, why can't we just jump to forgiveness right off the bat? Can't we start with that, especially after that drama, which was so powerful? And thank you so much for that, because it's important to lay out our pain and our sorrow from the perspective of people who have been hurt and people who have hurt others before God. And that is so important. And thank you so much for the author of that and for the people who did that and the beautiful music. But we can't start with forgiveness today, I'm sorry. And I think it just doesn't make sense to start with forgiveness. And think about a different story, a different context. Imagine if you have a friend in church, his name is Rob. And imagine Rob steals your house. You wonder, how could he possibly steal my house? How could Rob steal my house? He's smart. He did it while you were on holidays. He forged your signature on a deed. He sold the house. He got all the money, and he gambled it away. All while you were on holidays, you come back, your house is gone. So it's a crisis in your life. You're broken. You're devastated. You go to church, and you meet your friends at church, who are also Rob's friends, and they say to you, "Can you forgive Rob?" Well, obviously that's crazy. That's crazy. They should be asking you, how are you? How are you? Are you okay? How are you coping? Do you have a place to live? Has Rob stolen any other people's houses? Can we go with you to the police station to report what Rob did? Forgiveness isn't first. The Good Samaritan doesn't lean over the man on the Jericho road and say, "Can you forgive the thieves?" Not the first question. That's why I have to start with sin, even though I would like to jump to forgiveness. We're here at this conference because pastoral abuse is a sin that devastates the lives of individuals and families and communities. It's a sin of power, of abusing power. Church leaders are commissioned to help other people, and church leaders do so much good. I'm a church leader. I have been a church leader. I've been helped by church leaders. It's a gift of God that we empower people to help others. It's wonderful. But in exactly the same place where we can do so much good, we can also do harm, and that's where temptation comes to us to hurt others. In this talk, I'm saying pastors and pastoral abuse, but I mean all church leaders. Could be a Sunday school teacher or a youth leader, a church administrator, a band leader, anyone who we empower in the church to be a leader of others. In my experience, church leaders who've abused others are usually well-loved, wonderful people who have helped many. And they have a lot of power because of the way they help so many people. And they use that power in a bad way. Pastoral abuse can take a lot of different forms. It can be emotional abuse, when a church leader yells at someone and makes them feel bad about themselves, and instead of building them up, tears them down so they leave feeling worse. Or it's spiritual abuse, telling someone that God doesn't love them or that God will never forgive them. Or it can be sexual abuse, engaging in sexual activity with someone who you are supposed to care for. And that's what this conference is specifically about, sexual abuse by church leaders. But you can't separate those out, because emotional and spiritual abuse goes right along with sexual abuse. There's no hierarchy saying, well, it was just emotional abuse. That is just as bad. To be abused by a church leader in any way It's devastating because church is a place where we are supposed to be safe, where we're supposed to feel embraced and close to God. And if that place is not a safe place, it's a betrayal of what we think church is all about. If I try to explain the effect of what pastoral abuse can have on you, I think of what is a secular example, what might that be? And the thing I come up with is suppose you're mugged, if you're assaulted on the street by a stranger. Well, that's awful. That's devastating. It would change your life. But what if you were assaulted by a police officer in a police station? That's a different level of betrayal, because in our society, we empower the police to protect us. They are supposed to be there to be a safe place for us. So if we are being threatened, go to the police. They'll help you. And so if the place where it's supposed to be safe is the place where you are violated, that is an ultimate sort of betrayal. And that, of course, is why the Black Lives Matter movement is so energized, because for Black people, police officers and the justice system are not a place of safety for them. Churches are the place where we are supposed to be safe and to be close to God. And so to be assaulted by a church leader is a huge violation. It's a spiritual violation. People who have not been abused or who are just learning about pastoral abuse sometimes ask, why did you let them do that to you? Why didn't you just walk away? Why didn't you just leave? Sometimes pastoral abuse can involve physical violence and holding someone down and doing something to them, especially if it involves children. But often it involves coercion. The leader tells the church member that they're hurting, that they're abusing, that this is love. This is good. God wants this. I need you. This is a holy thing. They use the power they have as a minister, the influence they have as a minister, to get what they want for themselves. And that's a sin. Part of the sin of the pastoral abuse is who they choose to abuse, because they usually don't choose to abuse powerful people in the church. They choose the most vulnerable people who are already hurting, someone who's grieving, someone who's had a divorce, someone who is vulnerable in some way. Maybe they've been abused before, and their boundaries are a little bit unsteady. That's the person they'll zero in on to have a relationship with, because they know they can get away with it. Or maybe they'll choose someone who has mental health issues. So if that person ever comes forward to make a complaint, people will say, well, she's unstable. It is always the church leader's responsibility to maintain sexual boundaries. And every pastor today receives training about that in the denomination. Rules are crystal clear. No exceptions. It's strange, we live in this interesting cultural time of Me Too, where we're really emphasizing we should believe victims. And most people do think that we have too often silenced people, and we really do need to listen to people more. In the church, and I've seen people say, yes, we will believe victims when they come forward, and yet, when a victim comes forward, I see church people disbelieving them. So what's that about? I've seen victims accused of lying, accused of exaggerating, accused of tempting the pastor. Theoretically, we support victims, but when it happens to someone we know, a pastor we know, we think, well, this is the exception. This can't be really true. This person must be, I don't know what, troubled. Why are they making these things up? I think lots of times, because the pastor has never heard us, and they've helped us in many ways, and we love them, we think, well, they couldn't have hurt anyone else, because they've never hurt me. But of course, murderers don't murder everyone. They don't kill everyone they meet. They kill one person, and they still are a murderer. They are kind to many people, but they have decided to sin in one area of their life. And it's the same with pastoral abuse as well. We have a very hard time believing that good people, who we love, can sometimes do very bad things. I think we doubt victims too because we know it will make our world crumble if we actually believe that. If someone who we respected and trusted, our own pastor or a trusted colleague, could do that, and I trusted them, well, what does that mean for my judgment of character? You mean I can't look at people and tell? And that's really a tough way to live, because that's the truth, right? We can't tell who abuses and who doesn't. And it's such a high stakes thing, because if this person has abused someone and we have to have a complaint and we have to make it public and we have to have an investigation, what will that mean for our church? What will that mean for the gospel of Jesus Christ in our community when they see that the church, someone did that really bad thing, people won't want to come to our church? How will that affect our youth program? So I would rather disbelieve the victim and just move forward instead of going through that whole mess. What happens to victims that they are silenced and then they are troubled and then they have a lot of problems in their life because they aren't believed? The same thing can happen to congregations. If they will not look at the abuse that's happening in them, it's not like they can go on as normal. There's a wound that's buried that will fester until it comes out. And there are congregations that are troubled for decades because of pastoral abuse that was hidden, and people thought, well, if we just don't talk about it, it will go away. But unfortunately, it doesn't go away, and it can come back 10 or 20 or 30 years later. And we see that in churches today. I've been consistently told by the people I've worked with who have been abused by pastors or church leaders is that it's a devastating thing in your life when that happens. But they said there's something worse than being abused by a church leader. And that is when you go to the church to tell people to get help and they don't believe you. It's a type of crazy making. The church telling you that didn't happen. It's not as bad as you make it out to be. For example, that story I talked about with Rob stealing your house. If you go to church and tell them what happened and people say, "What house? Did you have a house? Are you sure you had a house?" Or, "You gave Rick that house. That was your signature on the paper. Why are you complaining it? Why do you keep talking about that house all the time? You have to let it go." It's essential that we listen to the stories of people who have been abused, walk with them on the long road to justice. I think about the story of the Good Samaritan, which is so useful in so many contexts. The thieves did the dirty work of attacking the man, but the story Jesus tells is about the church people, well, the religious people, not the church people, but the religious leaders who walk by the hurting person. The story is about not seeing the pain. That's what Jesus points out in the story. It's a sin to not listen to victims and to walk by their pain and to ignore them. So you thought I was just going to talk about sin with abusers, but no, the church can also be part of that system of not listening to the pain. So accountability. Jesus was a strong believer in accountability. If he saw people doing something wrong, he pointed it out, especially if they were religious leaders. When they did not do what they were supposed to do, he called them on it. He talked about truth and that the truth will set us free. The person who offended is accountable for the pain they have caused. For the victim who no longer trusts church leaders, who can feel unsafe in Christian community, often leaves the church because of the abuse, sometimes cannot believe in God anymore, can have problems with self-esteem, and intimacy can be so traumatized it can lead to marriage breakdown, and sometimes contemplate suicide because they can't deal with the pain anymore. Truly, the people I know who've been sexually abused by pastors, it's something, a trauma that is not months long or years long, it's decades long. In the past, the pain of survivors of pastoral abuse was overlooked. Hopefully now, churches have sexual misconduct policies in place. This is happening less often. What does accountability look like today? There are laws about sexual assault, and victims should be encouraged to lay charges if that is what they want to do. And they need to be supported if they go to the police to do that. An important reason to use the legal system in cases where a crime has been committed is because if the church tries to do it, they're not going to do a good job. They don't know how to conduct a criminal investigation, and they will do it wrong. They will not ask the right questions. They will ask hurtful questions to the victim, like, do you think it was wise to go to the hotel room? What were you wearing? Things like that are totally inappropriate. But also, when they interview the person who's accused, they may very easily have the wool pulled over their eyes, because in church, we trust people. That's our job in church, is to listen and think the best of people and encourage people. And if someone comes to us and says I didn't do it, well, he says he didn't do it. And he's our pastor, and he's always been trustworthy, and so then we believe them. Pastors are often very good with words. And they're very good liars when they want to be liars. We don't, in the church, encounter serial liars very often, and so we are unprepared to deal with that level of deception, and that's why law enforcement is really good for that, because that's what they deal with all the time. They can see through that. So I think it is important to report crimes to the police. However, personally, I don't hold out great hope for the justice system to bring justice. I have that little handout there. I don't know whether you had a chance to look at that. Statistics from 2012. In Canada, for every 1,000 sexual assaults, 33 are reported to the police, which I believe. I know a lot of people who've told me about being sexually assaulted, and I know only one person who's gone to the police, and charges weren't laid in that case. So of those 33 people who report, 12 have charges laid, 6 actually get to prosecution, and 3 are convicted. Other statistics I've looked up that are more recent from Statistics Canada show that 1/10 of the people who are prosecuted are convicted, but only half of those people go to jail. Canadians had a close look at what it means to go to trial and to charge someone with sexual assault with the Giangomeshi case. And look at what those women went through on the stand. You have to be really convinced that you want to do that before you go through it. And sometimes people, you have to count the cost of, I want to hold someone to justice. I want them to be convicted. You feel that now, but in 2.5 years, do you want to do that? Like, a lot of people want to move on with their life. They need to think about what it is they want to do. And so, yes, we want people to go to the police, but they don't have to. They can decide what they want to do. I hope the statistics will change. And I hope this Me Too movement is helping us rethink in our society, how do we deal with this problem of sexual abuse? Part of the problem with recognizing, with pastoral abuse and reporting it to the police is that it usually takes a long time for people to realize they've been abused because they've been coerced. It's not like someone attacked you, a stranger on the street, and you realize, I didn't know them, I didn't want to have a sexual relationship with them. It wasn't a relationship, it was an attack. I should go to the police. You might think that in 10 seconds, right? I'm being attacked. Whereas if it's your pastor and they're telling you that they love you and they've been grooming you for a couple of months and then something happens, you might think, well, maybe this is good. Maybe this is a good relationship. Maybe, do I want this? He says it's good. And you might really start to feel bad about it, but did I want this? Did he want this? Maybe he blames you. You shouldn't have worn that dress. What was that abuse or not? And a lot of people I know take months or years or decades to come to the realization they were abused. Sometimes it is because they were very vulnerable, they just had a death in their family or a divorce. And then 5 years later, they look back and say, I went for counseling and we ended up on the couch there. I didn't want that. How did that happen? Or they hear that it happened to another person. And that's when the light goes on. That happened to a couple of people. That was wrong. And so years have passed sometimes before they realize it's abuse, and then it's harder. There's no time limit. You can still go to the police, but there might not be as much evidence as there would have been if you went an hour after it happened. So there needs to be accountability to the laws of their country, of our country. But I hope that there's accountability to the church as well. Many churches make it hard to hold the abuser accountable because it's hard to lay a complaint. I just ask you, if you had a daughter who was 19 years old and she was abused by someone in your church, do you know exactly who you go to? Like, do you know where you go? Do you know what the policy says? Where would you find that policy? Would you have to call the church office to ask for it? Would you go to the church office? What if the 19-year-old girl was a newcomer to your church and she didn't have a mom in the church? Would she be able to go to the church and lay a complaint? What if the complaint policy says that the people who are going to adjudicate this are 3 men? Do you think that 19-year-old girl is going to go and tell her story to 3 men? I don't think she would do that. How do we make it possible for people to tell their story if they have it? And do we have policies that are accessible? I think about the College of Physicians and Surgeons. If you go to their website, there's a box, lay a complaint, how to lay a complaint, right there. There's the policy, read it. Am I abused? Here's the criteria. It's easy to see. But churches bury that information. We don't want people to think it could happen in church, and so we don't make policies available. And in your congregation, just ask yourself, do I know who I would go to if it happened? If you don't know, then the 19-year-old girl doesn't know either. So I think that is an area where we still need some improvement. And so then what happens when a complaint is filed? In the past, way too often, when someone would actually get up the courage to lay a complaint, someone might be let go. They might just, it probably happened. You should probably move on. But we don't want to make it public. We don't want to make this a big scene. Just please move along and don't work in a church again. That's what we tell someone. Like, this isn't the right job for you, and hope that they don't. But that doesn't work very well. First of all, it doesn't work for victims because they never got justice. It doesn't work to find out if there are other victims because the victim only knows she's the only victim, and the person who's accused says, well, it was only once, it was one person. But he's lied about everything else, so would he really tell you about everything? What's at stake for him? What's to gain for him by being honest here? Well, hopefully, his Christian conscience, but he has a lot to lose if he says more things. Maybe he'll go to the police. So he has a lot of motivation to not say the truth. And so then other victims are left hanging there. He just disappears. And you think, oh, well, he won't get another job somewhere. But he goes to another province, another denomination, another country. And if someone can lie about abuse, they can lie about their resume. And people get jobs somewhere else. They can say, oh, that was a bad experience at that conference. They were out to get me, and I got let go. But, I have all these talents. And they charm their way back into another job, and then they can abuse other people. That's why it's important that charges of sexual abuse be made public, so that if other victims are there, they can come forward, and there can be accountability. And maybe no one else will come forward, but maybe they will. And also then, if a person is convicted of being someone who has abused someone, that their name is known, who they are. And the reason for that is that if they go somewhere else, that they wouldn't be able to be lying about what happened, that it would be a public thing. That's why there's something called the Mennonite Abuse Prevention List that a group of people in the United States have have formed in order to make a list of people who have been convicted of pastoral abuse crimes so that they're on the internet, just to protect vulnerable people. So that's sin and accountability, but can we please move to forgiveness? Because wouldn't it all be better if we could just forgive each other and move on? And we all need forgiveness. Everyone does. And Jesus died for our sins and forgave us. And I thank God that I'm forgiven for the things I've done wrong. God can forgive even our worst sins. What does forgiveness mean in the context of this hard story? I don't think we always think that through very completely. Forgiveness and accountability should go hand in hand. One of my favorite books about abuse is by Mark Yancey in Ontario called Sexual Offending and Restoration. And in that book, he talks about that someone who has committed sexual abuse, not necessarily pastoral abuse, but some sort of sexual abuse, that they need at least a year of intensive counseling for them to realize what they did. They might look like they're sorry right away. They're sorry they got caught. They're sorry they can't keep doing what they were doing. They're sorry there are repercussions, and they may even cry and be really upset. But they don't have empathy yet, because if they had empathy, they wouldn't have been able to abuse someone. If the church steps in at this early stage of, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, and says, we forgive you, no one is helped, because the victim feels they've been erased. People have hardly started to hear their pain, and already you're talking about forgiveness. And what you've taught the person who offended is that they can abuse people and be immediately forgiven. They don't have to face the pain. They didn't have to hear about the pain. And they don't have to look at what was motivating them to violate others. Imagine if 6 months after Rob stole your house, you're living in a tiny apartment now. You're having a hard time forgiving Rob because of your changed circumstances, 20 years of your life, all that money gone. And you hear that the church is having a meeting to forgive Rob. He apologizes to the church. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have stolen that house. And the church says, we forgive you, Rob. Here, you can be our church treasurer now. You can see the problem here. You're the hurting person. You're still without a house. Rob hurt you. He needs to apologize to you. But he just went to the church, and the church acted as if they were the one that could offer forgiveness. Sometimes people who abuse bypass the person in order to get to that forgiveness stage. I was at an MCC meeting once where they had people sharing things. And it was a small group of people, like there were probably 20 of us in a room, and a man from Central America was there, and he told a heartbreaking story of how he had been a police officer in a Central American country, and he had tortured people. And now he'd become a Christian, and he was really sorry for what he did, and he was living with this terrible guilt of all the pain he caused. He said he couldn't stop thinking about all of the people that he hurt. And there's this long pause after this terrible, deep story. And a person in the group stood up and said, on behalf of everyone here, I want to tell you, friend, that we forgive you. I couldn't believe my ears. No one here was hurt by this man. No one here was tortured. No one had a loved one lost because of this. We can feel sorry for this man. We can acknowledge that he has a hard road. And we can wish him well and love him, but we cannot forgive him because he didn't hurt us in this situation. What needed to be said to him was, you need to find the people you hurt and hear what your actions did to them and see how you can make it right in some way. Forgiveness is a really long journey. It's a choice we make every day. It's not something that's easily offered. I think it's a gift from God. It's a miracle when it happens. And I think it's a miracle that comes in little bits. A big hurt in our life will take 70 times 7 times to forgive. You have to make 1,000,000 steps towards forgiveness, and that's a miracle from God. With the question of forgiveness comes the question of restoration. If the church leader is sorry, and if they go for counseling, suppose they do the year of counseling, and they do have genuine repentance, and there is some sort of reconciliation, can they be restored to a position of trust? A big question. Jesus was a strong advocate for forgiveness. He forgave people. He forgave Matthew for being a tax collector, for defrauding people. He even chose Matthew to be one of his disciples. But Jesus didn't put Matthew in charge of the money. Matthew didn't carry the purse for the disciples. Do you know who that was? It was Judas. You can imagine how hard that was for Matthew. He was the money expert. He counted money for a living. And Jesus looks, okay, who here is good for counting the money? Sorry, Matthew, not you. Jesus knew that money would be a temptation for Matthew, and he did not put Matthew in temptation's way again. You don't put the recovering alcoholic to work in a bar. Once we know someone has violated boundaries, we know that's an area where they can be tempted. If we love that person, we will be careful to protect them from falling into harm again, and we will protect vulnerable people from being hurt. It doesn't mean we don't love them. It doesn't mean they can't be part of our community and find other ways to serve the Lord, but to serve in a place where they have access to vulnerable people, it's not a wise decision. Pastoral abuse is a sin in the church that leads to brokenness. Today I talked about sin and accountability and forgiveness, and I hope that we can take abuse seriously in the way we act and in our theology, because the people we love are both victims and people who abuse. They are our brothers and sisters in the church. Thanks.